April 12, 1945. Near the Rhine, Western Front, Germany. The shell fragment entered Dr. Kurt Rictor's chest with a sound he would never forget. A wet, tearing thud that seemed to echo through his rib cage before the pain arrived. He fell backward into the muddy crater, his medical bag tumbling from his shoulder, instruments scattering across blood-soaked earth. Above him, the sky churned with smoke from American artillery, dark clouds rolling eastward like judgment itself. Rictor pressed his palm against the wound, feeling hot blood pulse between his fingers. His medical training, honed through 4 years of treating Wehrmacht casualties from Moscow to the Ardennes, diagnosed his condition with clinical precision, penetrating chest trauma, probable lung laceration, severe hemorrhage. Without immediate surgical intervention, he would bleed to death within the hour. The irony was not lost on him, a doctor dying for lack of a doctor, on a front line abandoned by both armies in the chaotic collapse of the Reich. The front had disintegrated so completely that Rictor found himself surrounded not by comrades, but by ghosts. A dozen wounded German soldiers lay scattered across the cratered landscape, some moaning, others silent with the stillness that precedes death. The aid station he had been attempting to reach no longer existed, destroyed by American bombs 3 days earlier. Behind him, somewhere in the smoke and confusion, the remains of his division retreated eastward. Ahead, the rumble of American tanks grew louder with each passing minute. Fear seized him more completely than pain. Not the fear of death. He had made peace with mortality somewhere between Stalingrad and Normandy, but the fear of captivity. For years, Nazi propaganda had filled his ears with stories of American brutality. Prisoners tortured, doctors executed, wounded left to die in ditches. The Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda had distributed leaflets throughout the Wehrmacht, showing grotesque illustrations of American soldiers bayoneting captured Germans, burning prisoners alive, conducting savage medical experiments. Major Rictor, Oberstabsarzt in the Wehrmacht Medical Service, knew what awaited medical officers in enemy hands. The Allies would surely execute him for his association with the regime, regardless of his role as a healer. The sound of boots in mud brought his head up. American soldiers, young men with mud-caked uniforms and rifles held ready, were moving through the crater field. Rictor watched them approach with the detachment of a man observing his own execution. This was the end, then. 4 years of medical school at Heidelberg, 6 years of military service, 34 years of life, all terminating in a shell hole on the Western Front, bleeding out while enemy soldiers decided his fate. But what happened next defied every expectation forged by years of propaganda. Medic! The American soldier's shout cut through the artillery thunder. "We got wounded here. Jerry Doctor's hit bad." 2 soldiers knelt beside Rictor, their movements efficient, professional. One began examining his wound while the other called for a stretcher. They spoke in English, a language Rictor understood from his medical studies, and their tone was neither hostile nor mocking. It was clinical, concerned even. "Lung wound, probably fragment," the medic muttered, pulling a pressure dressing from his pack. "Needs evacuation now, or he's gone." The dressing was clean, impossibly clean by Wehrmacht standards of April 1945, when German field hospitals were running on salvaged bandages and boiled cloth. The American pressed it firmly against Rictor's chest, and the pain that followed was almost welcome, because it meant someone was trying to save him. "You a doctor?" the American asked in broken German. When Rictor nodded weakly, the soldier's expression shifted to something approaching respect. "Okay, Doc. We'll get you sorted. Just hang on." They loaded him onto a canvas stretcher, American manufacture, he noted distantly, with metal poles and proper handles, and carried him toward the rear. Rictor's last glimpse of the battlefield showed American medics moving among the other wounded Germans, administering first aid with the same efficiency they had shown him. No bayonets, no torture, just methodical medical triage, exactly as he himself would have conducted it. The morphine they injected took effect as they loaded him into an ambulance, and Rictor's consciousness began to fragment. Through the fog of pain and medication, he registered details that made no sense. The ambulance interior was clean, organized, equipped with oxygen and plasma. The American medic monitoring him checked his pulse and respiration regularly. They were driving him toward the rear, toward treatment, not toward a ditch for execution. Everything he had been taught to expect was wrong. Into the labyrinth of American medicine. The American medical evacuation system in the spring of 1945 was a precisely orchestrated machine that had evolved through 5 years of warfare across 3 continents. Dr. Rictor, drifting in and out of consciousness, became one of thousands of casualties, enemy and allied alike, flowing through this system during the final collapse of Nazi Germany. From the front line, casualties moved to battalion aid stations, then to collecting points, then to field hospitals, and finally to evacuation hospitals positioned 30 to 50 miles behind the front. The entire system was designed to move a wounded soldier from battlefield to operating table in under 6 hours, a standard that German military medicine had abandoned sometime around the Battle of Stalingrad. Richter's stretcher passed through this assembly line of survival with mechanical efficiency. At each stage, American medical personnel examined him, updated his chart, administered medication. The morphine kept him drifting, but his medical training remained alert, cataloging observations that contradicted everything he knew about wartime medicine: abundant supplies, specialized equipment, professional coordination between units. This was not the improvised desperation he had witnessed in Wehrmacht field hospitals for the past 2 years. This was systematic, industrial-scale medical care. By the time his ambulance reached the evacuation hospital, a sprawling complex of khaki tents and wooden buildings surrounded by Red Cross flags, Rictor had lost significant blood. The American medics knew it. A nurse checked his blood pressure, frowned, and called for immediate surgical prep. They unloaded him at a receiving tent where doctors in clean white coats conducted rapid triage. German POW, Major Medical Service, an American officer read from Richter's hastily prepared chart. Penetrating chest wound, left lung, severe hemorrhage. Vitals unstable. Or 2, a surgeon replied without hesitation. Get him prepped. Type and cross-match for transfusion. They were going to operate immediately. No waiting line, no triage demotion because he was enemy. No delay while they treated American casualties first. Dr. Kurt Rictor, major in the Wehrmacht Medical Service, officer of a collapsing regime that had unleashed unprecedented horror upon the world, was about to receive emergency surgery from his enemies. The absurdity of it penetrated even through his shock and blood loss. The theater of redemption. The operating theater blazed with electric light, not the flickering generator-powered bulbs of German field hospitals, but steady, brilliant illumination that rendered every surgical detail visible. Rictor, half-conscious on the operating table, registered this first: light, pure, unwavering light. An anesthesiologist, a specialist whose sole function was managing surgical anesthesia, a luxury German military medicine had abandoned years earlier, leaned over him. "You're going to sleep now, doctor. When you wake up, we'll have you fixed." The words were spoken in English, but their meaning was universal. Rictor tried to speak, to explain the propaganda, the fear, the impossible contradiction between expectation and reality. But the anesthetic mask descended over his face, and consciousness dissolved into chemical darkness. He did not witness his own surgery, but his medical training could reconstruct it later from the evidence. The American surgical team, led by a major with extensive thoracic surgery experience, opened his chest through a lateral thoracotomy approach. They located the shell fragment lodged in his left upper lobe, extracted it along with damaged tissue, repaired the laceration with absorbable sutures, drained the pleural space, and closed in layers. The entire procedure took 97 minutes. What Richter's unconscious mind could not comprehend, what no amount of surgical experience could have prepared him for, was the systematic professionalism with which his enemies saved his life. The surgical team maintained absolute sterile technique. The anesthesiologist monitored his vitals continuously. Nurses anticipated instrument needs before the surgeon asked. Blood transfusions, typed and cross-matched, hung ready. Penicillin, the miracle antibiotic that German military medicine had never obtained in significant quantities, was administered prophylactically to prevent infection. By the standards of Wehrmacht field hospitals in April 1945, the surgery represented impossible abundance: unlimited electricity, sterile equipment, specialized instruments, trained staff, pharmaceutical supplies. By the standards of American military medicine, it was routine. When consciousness returned, Richter's first sensation was absence of pain. Not reduction of pain, but its near complete absence, a state so alien after hours of agony that his first confused thought was that he had died. Then came the awareness of his chest, tight with bandages, and the rhythmic hiss of oxygen flowing through a mask. His eyes opened to white canvas ceiling, clean air, and the smell of antiseptic rather than gangrene. "Welcome back, Major. Welcome back." The voice spoke German with an American accent. A nurse, female, young, professional, checked his pulse while consulting a chart. "Your surgery went well. Dr. Harrison managed to save most of your lung. You're very lucky." Lucky. The word seemed obscene. He was a prisoner, an enemy, a member of the Wehrmacht medical service that had participated in, or at least witnessed, unspeakable crimes. Yet here he lay, alive, recovering, receiving medical care that exceeded what German military hospitals could provide to their own wounded. The transformation recovery in an American prisoner of war hospital defied Dr. Richter's every expectation forged by years of Nazi propaganda. The days that followed his surgery introduced him to a medical reality so divorced from his experience that he began to question the fundamental truths upon which he had built his professional life. Nurses checked his temperature every 4 hours using mercury thermometers. German field hospitals had long since run out of such luxuries. They changed his bandages daily with fresh gauze soaked in antiseptic solution. Wehrmacht medical units were reusing bandages by the winter of 1944. They provided him with aspirin for pain relief, a commodity that had become scarce in Germany by mid-1944. Most remarkably, they served him 3 full meals daily: meat, vegetables, bread, and milk. Real milk, not the ersatz substitutes German civilians had endured since 1942. The abundance was almost obscene. Rictor, who had spent the previous 2 years watching German soldiers die from infections that proper antibiotics could have prevented, from blood loss that transfusions could have reversed, from shock that adequate intravenous fluids could have treated, now found himself surrounded by medical resources that seemed unlimited. Sulfa drugs, carefully rationed in German military medicine, were used liberally. Penicillin, completely unavailable to Wehrmacht doctors, was administered routinely to prevent post-operative infections. But the material abundance, shocking as it was, paled before the psychological transformation that began 3 days after his surgery. An American doctor, Captain James Miller, Harvard Medical School, thoracic surgery, approached Richter's bed with a colleague and several medical students. They were conducting rounds, a familiar ritual from Richter's own medical training. What happened next was unfamiliar. "Major Rictor," Captain Miller said in careful German, "we have a patient 3 beds down with a similar presentation to your case, shell fragment to the left lung, but with complications we didn't see in your injury. Would you mind if we discuss the case with you? Your perspective as a medical officer would be valuable." The words hung in the air like an impossible equation. Your perspective would be valuable. Not "tell us what you know, prisoner," or "you will answer our questions," but a collegial request for professional consultation. Rictor, still weak from surgery, struggled to comprehend. Yes, of course," he managed. What followed was a medical consultation that could have occurred in any civilian hospital in peacetime. Captain Miller described the patient, an American sergeant with lung laceration, complicated by hemothorax and early signs of empyema. Rictor, drawing on his experience treating similar cases during the winter battles, suggested aggressive drainage combined with antibiotics. Miller nodded, asked follow-up questions, discussed treatment options. The medical students took notes. No one mentioned nationality. No one referenced the uniform Rictor had worn. In that moment, they were simply doctors discussing how to save a life. "Thank you, Major," Miller said when the consultation concluded. "Your experience with field trauma is extensive. We'd appreciate your input on other cases if you're willing." Willing. as if Rictor had a choice, as if his opinion mattered, as if professional respect transcended the fact that they had been enemies mere days earlier. The Library of Contradictions. 1 week after his surgery, when Rictor could sit upright without pain, an American medical officer arrived at his bedside carrying an armload of journals. They were recent publications: the Journal of the American Medical Association, The Lancet, the New England Journal of Medicine, printed on good paper with clear photographs and detailed illustrations. Pre-war German medical libraries had subscribed to such journals. By 1945, German doctors were lucky to receive mimeographed bulletins on salvaged paper. "Thought you might want something to read, doctor," the American said. "Some of these articles cover new techniques we're using. The penicillin studies might interest you particularly." He left the journals stacked beside Richter's bed and departed before Rictor could formulate a response. The gesture was so casual, so devoid of suspicion or hostility, that it took several minutes for its implications to register. They were sharing current medical knowledge with an enemy physician, not interrogating him about German military medicine, not extracting intelligence, simply sharing knowledge, as colleagues might. Rictor opened the top journal with trembling hands. The first article described large-scale penicillin trials in battlefield conditions, 700,000 doses administered during the first half of 1944 alone. The results were staggering. Mortality from infected wounds reduced by over 50% compared to sulfa drugs alone. Sepsis rates dropped precipitously. Soldiers who would have died from gas gangrene or post-operative infections survived. The article included photographs: soldiers with severe wounds healing cleanly, surgical sites showing minimal inflammation, amputation sites that remained uninfected. Rictor, who had watched countless Wehrmacht soldiers die from infections that penicillin could have prevented, felt something crack inside his chest, not his surgical wound, but something deeper. A certainty he had carried about the nature of war, of enemies, of the inevitable brutality that arose when nations fought. Over the following weeks, Rictor devoured every journal he could obtain. American medical officers, discovering his hunger for knowledge, provided more: articles on blood transfusion protocols, surgical techniques for thoracic trauma, rehabilitation methods for wounded soldiers. One captain brought him a textbook on antibiotic therapy, published in 1944, already in its second edition. The dedication read, "To the medical officers of all nations who labor to heal regardless of flag or allegiance." The dedication struck Rictor as either incredibly naive or incredibly wise. He could not yet determine which. The consultation 10 days after his surgery, Rictor attended his first formal medical consultation. An American orderly wheeled him to a conference room, an actual room with chairs, a table, a blackboard, and electric lighting, where a dozen American medical officers had gathered to discuss difficult cases. Captain Miller, who had consulted with Rictor earlier, nodded as Richter's wheelchair was positioned at the table. "Gentlemen," Miller said, "Major Rictor has extensive experience with battlefield trauma under resource-limited conditions. I've asked him to join us." The other American doctors nodded. One rose and shook Richter's hand. "Major, pleased to have your perspective." Your perspective. Again, that impossible phrase. Rictor found himself participating in a medical case conference that would have been familiar in any academic hospital anywhere in the world. An American surgeon presented a complicated abdominal wound case. Another doctor discussed a soldier with persistent infection despite sulfadiazine treatment. A third sought advice on a German prisoner with burns. Could German military medicine offer insights into treatment protocols? Rictor spoke hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. He described techniques Wehrmacht field hospitals had developed for treating burns with limited supplies. He explained triage protocols German doctors used when casualty loads overwhelmed capacity. He detailed surgical approaches that German military medicine had innovated on the Eastern Front. The American doctors listened. They asked questions. They debated treatment options. At no point did anyone reference the fact that Rictor represented a military that had invaded half of Europe, that had committed atrocities across the continent, that had turned medical science into an instrument of genocide. In this room, for these hours, only medicine mattered. Only saving lives mattered. When the consultation ended, Captain Miller approached Richter's wheelchair. "Thank you, Major. Your experience with resource scarcity is valuable. German military medicine developed some innovative approaches under difficult conditions. Captain," Rictor said slowly, "I must ask, why do you treat me this way, as a colleague rather than a prisoner?" Miller considered the question. "You're a doctor, Major. So am I. The uniform doesn't change that. The Hippocratic Oath doesn't have exemptions for nationality." The words were simple, almost simplistic, yet they carried a weight that Rictor felt in his healing chest. For 4 years, he had practiced medicine in service of a regime that had turned healing into harm, that had corrupted the fundamental ethics of medical practice. Now his enemies were demonstrating medical principles that the Wehrmacht had abandoned, or never truly embraced. The education. As Richter's physical recovery progressed, his medical education deepened, American doctors, discovering his willingness to learn and discuss medical advances, included him in ward rounds, surgical observations, and informal teaching sessions. He witnessed procedures that Wehrmacht military medicine could no longer perform: complex orthopedic reconstructions, neurosurgical interventions, plastic surgery for severe burns. The pharmaceutical abundance particularly astonished him. American military hospitals maintained extensive medication inventories that ensured appropriate drugs were available for any medical situation. German hospitals, by contrast, had improvised treatments based on whatever medications were available rather than optimal therapeutic protocols. The difference in patient outcomes was stark. American soldiers with severe infections recovered routinely. German soldiers with similar injuries died. One afternoon, an American pharmacist showed Rictor the hospital's medication storage area. Rows of shelves held bottles, ampules, and packages, penicillin in various preparations, sulfa drugs, morphine, plasma, glucose solutions, vitamins, antiseptics. The pharmacist explained storage protocols, usage tracking, reorder procedures. It was logistics as medicine, medicine as logistics, a systematic approach to healing that treated medical supplies with the same rigor that armies applied to ammunition. "How do you maintain such abundance?" Rictor asked. "The supply lines alone." "American industrial capacity," the pharmacist replied. "Once we committed to mass penicillin production, pharmaceutical companies retooled entire factories. By D-Day last June, we had enough penicillin to treat all Allied forces. Production just keeps increasing." The phrase American industrial capacity captured something Rictor had observed but not articulated. The Americans approached warfare and military medicine as engineering problems to be solved through resources, organization, and systematic methodology. It was warfare as factory production, medicine as manufacturing process, efficient, abundant, impersonal in its machinery, but intensely personal in its application to individual patients. The transformation complete. 6 weeks after his capture, Dr. Kurt Rictor stood, without assistance, for the first time since his surgery. His left lung had healed remarkably. The American surgeons pronounced him fit for light duty. Under Geneva Convention protocols, he would be assigned to work in the prisoner of war hospital, treating fellow German prisoners under American supervision. The assignment formalized what had become informal reality. Rictor was again practicing medicine. But the medicine he now practiced differed fundamentally from Wehrmacht military medicine. He had access to supplies, equipment, and pharmaceuticals that German military hospitals had not seen in years. He worked alongside American medical officers who treated him as a colleague rather than an enemy. He learned techniques and protocols that German medical education had never taught. Most significantly, he witnessed daily the practical application of medical ethics divorced from nationalism. American medical personnel treated German prisoners with the same professionalism they afforded American soldiers. Nurses changed dressings, administered medications, provided comfort with equal attention regardless of patient nationality. Surgeons operated on enemy wounded with the same skill and effort they applied to Allied casualties. The official policy, Rictor learned, was straightforward. Geneva Convention mandated equal medical treatment for prisoners of war. American military hospitals followed this mandate rigorously. German wounded received the same surgical procedures, medications, and rehabilitation services as American soldiers. This equality of treatment, often ignored by belligerents throughout history, was consistently applied in American facilities. The contrast with Richter's experience in Wehrmacht hospitals was absolute. German military medicine had practiced triage that prioritized soldiers based on recovery probability and return to combat potential. Resources went to those who could fight again. The severely wounded, those unlikely to return to duty, received minimal treatment. Ethical considerations surrendered to military necessity. American medicine made no such calculations. Or rather, it made different calculations. Every life had value, every patient deserved optimal care, every wounded soldier, enemy or ally, received treatment according to medical need rather than political status. It was medicine as Rictor had learned it in medical school, before war corrupted medical ethics into instruments of military efficiency. The testimony. In late May 1945, with Germany's surrender official and the war in Europe ended, an American medical officer conducted interviews with German medical personnel for official documentation. When the officer reached Rictor, now working full-time in the POW hospital ward, he asked standard questions about treatment, conditions, compliance with Geneva Conventions. Richter's answers went beyond the questionnaire. "Before my capture," he said slowly, choosing words carefully, "I believed what we were told, that Americans would torture prisoners, that medical officers would be executed, that capture meant death, or worse. Every expectation I held was wrong." The American officer waited, pen poised. "Your medical system," Rictor continued, "demonstrates principles that German military medicine abandoned: equal treatment regardless of nationality, professional respect for medical colleagues regardless of uniform, abundant resources applied to healing rather than rationed by military necessity, medicine practiced as healing art rather than military logistics. We follow Geneva Conventions, Major. It's required." "Yes," Rictor agreed, "but you follow them completely, systematically, without exception. The difference between requirement and implementation is profound." The officer made notes. After a pause, he asked, "Will you return to medical practice in Germany?" "If permitted, yes. But not the medical practice I knew before, not Wehrmacht military medicine. Something different, something based on principles I witnessed here." "What principles?" Rictor considered the question carefully. "That respect for a doctor is not connected with nationality or politics, but only with the desire to save lives. That medical ethics transcend national allegiance, that healing is universal, or it is nothing." The officer wrote this down verbatim. Years later, Rictor would learn that his testimony became part of official documentation about POW treatment, cited in studies about medical ethics in warfare, referenced in discussions about Geneva Convention implementation. The return, July 1945. Dr. Kurt Rictor, repatriated to Germany as part of organized POW releases, stood amid the ruins of what had been his country. The contrast between the organized abundance of American POW hospitals and the devastation of Germany was almost too stark to comprehend. Cities reduced to rubble, hospitals destroyed or barely functioning, medical supplies virtually non-existent, doctors attempting to practice medicine with resources that made Wehrmacht field hospitals look abundant by comparison. Yet amid this devastation, Rictor discovered opportunities. Allied occupation authorities, particularly in the American and British zones, sought German medical professionals untainted by direct Nazi association to help rebuild healthcare systems. Rictor, whose Wehrmacht service record showed no war crimes and whose testimony from American captivity documented professional conduct, received approval to resume medical practice. More significantly, he found himself appointed to committees discussing medical system reconstruction in what would become West Germany. These committees, composed of German doctors and Allied medical advisors, debated fundamental questions. How should post-war German medicine be organized? What principles should guide medical practice? How could medical ethics be restored after 12 years of Nazi corruption of medical science? Richter's answers to these questions drew directly from his experience in American captivity. He advocated for medical systems based on democratic principles, equal access to care regardless of social status, professional autonomy divorced from political control, medical ethics grounded in universal human dignity rather than racial ideology. He cited repeatedly the example of American POW hospitals where doctors helped enemies without discrimination. Not all his colleagues agreed. Some older physicians, trained in pre-Nazi German medical tradition, but compromised by 12 years of accommodation to the regime, resisted fundamental reform. They argued for restoration of traditional German medical hierarchy, for professional autonomy that shielded doctors from accountability. They downplayed the extent to which German medicine had been corrupted by Nazi ideology. Rictor confronted these arguments with testimony from his own experience. I witnessed medical practice divorced from national hatred. American doctors treated enemy wounded as they treated their own soldiers. This is not weakness. This is the essence of medical ethics. If German medicine is to recover, we must embrace these principles completely without reservation. The legacy. Over the following decades, Dr. Kurt Rictor became known throughout West Germany as an advocate for medical reform, humane patient treatment, and professional equality regardless of background. He published articles in German medical journals describing his experiences as a POW and arguing for implementation of American medical principles. He lectured at medical schools about medical ethics in warfare. He served on committees overseeing hospital administration and medical education reform. His advocacy influenced West German medical system development in subtle but significant ways. The emphasis on patient rights, the integration of modern pharmaceutical protocols, the professional equality between doctors regardless of origin. These principles, which Rictor had witnessed in American POW hospitals, gradually became embedded in West German medical practice. Not that German medical reform can be attributed solely to Richter's influence. Allied occupation policies, broader democratization efforts, and generational change all contributed to transforming German healthcare. But within medical circles, Richter's testimony carried particular weight because it came from lived experience, from direct observation of how medicine could be practiced differently. His most lasting contribution may have been educational. Rictor taught medical students, a generation too young to have served in the Wehrmacht, but old enough to remember the war's devastation, that medical practice required moral foundation beyond technical skill. He used his own story as cautionary tale. A doctor trained in excellent pre-Nazi medical tradition, who served a criminal regime, who learned fundamental medical ethics from his enemies during captivity. Medicine is not neutral, he told students repeatedly. Medical skill divorced from ethical grounding becomes instrument of harm. I learned this in an American POW hospital where doctors who should have hated me treated me with professional respect. They demonstrated that healing transcends nationality, or it ceases to be healing. The reckoning. In his later years, Rictor spoke more openly about the psychological transformation his captivity had forced. In a 1965 interview, 20 years after his capture, he articulated what those weeks in American captivity had meant. Nazi propaganda had prepared me for death in American hands. Instead, I found life. That contradiction forced me to question everything I had been taught, everything I had believed about the enemy, about warfare, about the fundamental nature of the conflict. When American doctors addressed me as Herr Doctor, when they included me in medical consultations, when they shared their knowledge without suspicion or hatred, they demonstrated principles that German military medicine had abandoned: professional respect, equality of colleagues, medicine as universal human endeavor rather than instrument of national interest. My physical wound healed within months. The psychological wound, the realization of how thoroughly I had been deceived, how completely German medicine had been corrupted, that took years to heal, if it ever truly did. This reckoning, personal and professional, characterized Richter's post-war career. He became known as a doctor willing to confront German medicine's complicity in Nazi crimes, willing to acknowledge that Wehrmacht medical service, even when not directly committing atrocities, had participated in a fundamentally criminal enterprise by supporting the military machine that enabled genocide. Yet he balanced this acknowledgement with testimony about transformation. His story demonstrated that even complicit individuals could learn, change, embrace different principles. American medical officers had treated him not as a redeemable enemy, but as professional colleague capable of redemption through education and ethical practice. This treatment, Rictor argued, modeled how post-war Germany itself should approach the difficult work of moral reconstruction. The wider context. Richter's experience, remarkable as it was to him personally, represented broader patterns in American treatment of German POWs during and after World War II. By war's end, the United States held approximately 380,000 German prisoners within its borders and tens of thousands more in European camps. Medical treatment of these prisoners generally followed Geneva Convention protocols, with POW hospitals established specifically for enemy wounded. The two largest German POW hospitals in the United States, Glennon General Hospital in Oklahoma and Camp Forest in Tennessee, treated thousands of German wounded with the same medical protocols applied to American soldiers. German doctors worked alongside American medical officers. Penicillin and other scarce medications were administered to enemy wounded. Surgical techniques were shared. Medical knowledge was exchanged. This systematic implementation of Geneva Convention medical provisions contrasted sharply with practices in other theaters and by other belligerents. German military hospitals treated Soviet POWs abominably, with mortality rates exceeding 50% in some camps. Japanese treatment of Allied POWs was notoriously brutal, with inadequate medical care contributing to death rates above 25%. Even Western Allied POWs in German hands, while generally better treated than Soviet prisoners, experienced declining medical care as German resources collapsed. American adherence to Geneva Convention medical standards was not entirely altruistic. Reciprocity considerations played a role. Treating German POWs well theoretically encouraged similar treatment of American prisoners in German hands. Practical considerations mattered too. Healthy prisoners could work, reducing labor shortages. Political calculations factored in. Demonstrating humane treatment supported propaganda about American values. But for individual prisoners like Rictor, motivations mattered less than implementation. Whatever the reasons, American military medicine treated enemy wounded with professionalism, provided abundant resources, maintained ethical standards. The gap between this reality and Nazi propaganda about American brutality was absolute. The principle. At its core, Richter's story illustrates a fundamental tension in military medicine, the conflict between medical ethics mandating equal treatment for all patients and military necessity demanding prioritization of one's own forces. Different nations and different medical systems resolved this tension differently during World War II. German military medicine increasingly subordinated medical ethics to military necessity. By 1944, Wehrmacht field hospitals practiced triage that effectively condemned severely wounded soldiers to death through neglect, concentrating limited resources on soldiers likely to return to combat. German treatment of non-German wounded, particularly Soviet POWs, represented complete abandonment of medical ethics in favor of racial ideology and military expedience. American military medicine, while operating under resource constraints and military pressures, maintained formal commitment to Geneva Convention standards requiring equal treatment of enemy wounded. This commitment was not always perfectly implemented. Field hospitals in active combat zones sometimes prioritized Allied casualties, but it remained official policy and general practice. POW hospitals, removed from immediate combat pressure, implemented equal treatment systematically. The principle that guided this practice, that medical ethics transcend national allegiance, that healing is universal obligation, represented an ideal often honored more in breach than observance throughout human history. American military medicine in World War II, whatever its imperfections, demonstrated that this ideal could be approximated even during total war. For Rictor, witnessing this principle in practice transformed his understanding of both medicine and morality. He had served a regime that corrupted medical ethics into racial ideology, that turned healing into instrument of genocide, that made doctors accomplices to crimes against humanity. His captivity by enemies who treated him according to principles his own country had abandoned forced a reckoning with these realities. Conclusion: the wound that never healed. Dr. Kurt Rictor died in 1978 at the age of 67, having practiced medicine in West Germany for 33 years after his repatriation. His obituaries noted his contributions to medical education reform, his advocacy for humane patient treatment, his work establishing professional standards divorced from political ideology. They mentioned his service in the Wehrmacht medical service, but emphasized his post-war career as medical reformer. What the obituaries could not fully capture was the internal transformation that began in an American POW hospital in the spring of 1945. Rictor had entered American captivity expecting death and experiencing instead systematic professional medical care that contradicted every expectation. This contradiction between propaganda and reality, between expectation and experience, between the medicine he had practiced and the medicine he witnessed, created a psychological wound that never entirely healed. But unlike the physical wound from that shell fragment, which healed completely through American surgical skill, this psychological wound proved productive. It forced Rictor to question, to learn, to change. It drove his post-war advocacy for medical reform. It informed his teaching of younger doctors. It shaped his understanding of medical ethics as universal obligation rather than national prerogative. In his final published article written in 1977, Rictor reflected on that moment of transformation. A shell fragment nearly killed me in April 1945. American doctors saved my life and, in doing so, forced me to confront the lies I had accepted, the compromises I had made, the fundamental moral failure of the system I had served. They did not save me through special effort or extraordinary means. They saved me by practicing medicine according to principles that should be universal but often are not. Equal treatment regardless of nationality, professional respect regardless of political allegiance, commitment to healing as fundamental human obligation. I spent the rest of my life trying to implement those principles in German medicine. It has been inadequate repayment for the gift of life those American doctors gave me. But it has been, I hope, sufficient acknowledgement of the lesson they taught. That medicine practiced according to universal ethical principles is not weakness, but the highest expression of our profession's purpose. The shell fragment that wounded Dr. Kurt Rictor in April 1945 was eventually removed and preserved. American surgeons gave it to him as a keepsake upon his repatriation. He kept it on his desk throughout his medical career, a physical reminder of the wound that changed everything, the injury that forced transformation, the violence that paradoxically led to healing. That fragment, now preserved in a German medical museum, stands as small testament to larger truth. That even in total war, medical ethics can transcend national hatred, that enemies can treat enemies as human beings deserving dignity, that healing, when practiced according to its fundamental principles, recognizes no borders, no nationalities, no political allegiances. It is a truth easily forgotten, frequently violated, imperfectly honored. But for Dr. Kurt Rictor, who entered American captivity expecting death and found instead professional respect and systematic medical care, it became the defining truth of his life. The wound healed. The lesson remained.